everybody. So a couple of things. Just wanted to check in and say hey. We are going to be having office hours on Wednesday. If you have anything you want to check in with me about, any questions that you have, concerns that you have, if you just want to say hi, anything is okay. But that's Wednesday at 2:45, and there is a link for the module. This is going to be our lecture for the week. There's just going to be one, but I'm going to just be talking to you guys about World War II on the home front. So we kind of are like taking a step back because I know the last thing we talked about was the atomic bomb. So we're kind of taking a step back, but we're going to look at how America was impacted during the war. I'm going to try to make it quick. I'm thinking, well, I mean, it's going to be like 20 minutes. I don't know if you guys think that's quick or not. Yeah, and then after you watch the lecture, there's going to be some options. You have 3 assignments this week. So you guys are going to go through those, and that's the plan. So let's jump straight into it. I'm going to switch my screen around. And start us off. So, World War II on the home front. As soon as, and I realized actually I probably should have done this before we did the decision to drop the atomic bomb, but it's okay. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the internment camps that we had talked about last week, the United States had to prepare themselves for war. Oh, by the way, go ahead and continue your notes on whatever you've been taking notes on. The United States had to get ready for war, so they launched the Selective Service Act. You guys might remember that from our talk on World War I. This is now the second time that the U.S. calls up the draft, except for this time they drafted 10 million men. So this was even larger scale than World War II, and part of that is because we got involved in World War II much quicker than we got involved in World War I. The United States fought for 4 solid years in maybe more like 3 solid years in World War II, as opposed to like the few months really that we committed troops for World War I. As we always talk about, whenever there's a war industries exploded, and that is part of the reason why the United States comes out of the Great Depression, because there's a huge demand for jobs. All the munitions, everything that you need for war, absolutely explodes. There is also this intense rationing of food and gas and any materials that you might have dedicated to the war front were, and people rationed back home. So it's kind of like the standard total war propaganda, all that good stuff was going on in the United States, kind of similar to World War I, but on an even larger scale. So you also saw women jump into working in these wartime positions. You see women, there were 6 million women that actually stepped up to work in these wartime positions that were not previously working. And a lot of this is fueled and encouraged by propaganda, because they're so desperate to have workers, because if they're drafting 10 million men, then they have this deficit of people that they need in the workforce. This is actually one of your assignments this week. You're going to have a discussion looking at in this image. So I want you guys, this is a good quality image of it. I want you guys to just look at kind of what you notice in this image. I'm not going to dive too deeply into it, but this was published by in the Post. This was Rockwell's kind of like depiction of this Rosie the Riveter. This is a riveting machine, which is why she's called Rosie the Riveter. This would allow you to attach bolts onto, whatever you need to attach bolts on. So I just want you guys to pay attention to what it is that she's doing, what she looks like, how she's depicted, and I'm not going to say anything more because I want you to dive into that in the discussion. But women were portrayed in this like, okay, come fill in these wartime positions. America needs you. So this is just like kind of one of those examples of propaganda. that you would have seen. Another way that the United States answered the demand for wartime industry was to initiate the Bracero program. So the Bracero program was initiated, and it was actually a formal signed contract between the Mexican government and the United States government. And it was a program that brought Mexican laborers to fill in wartime production shortages. It started in 1942, so you guys can say it's like when the United States is involved in the war, and it lasts until it officially ends 1964. Although there weren't workers being pulled in the like numbers that they were during the war. It was mostly agricultural labor that these braceros would come and work in. This is where you actually started to see. So it was, you guys can notice, like, people would actually sit down and sign a contract. These bracero workers would sit down and sign a contract agreeing to the pay. A lot of the time, you guys, the pay was really low and there were long working hours, but a lot of these workers were facing kind of difficult situations back home in Mexico. The government was sort of struggling at this point in time, and so they still saw it as a way to provide for their families and an opportunity to get some money. So even though it wasn't great pay, a lot of people were still willing to sign up for the program. Unfortunately, when the braceros came over to the United States, they were subject to a lot of mistreatment and a lot of racism, and a lot of that was because was from people that were competing for similar jobs, and so you see that really intensify after the war ends. So this is kind of moving forward a little bit, but I just want to kind of like fully talk about it. So the United States, as soon as the war ends, the Bracero program technically wasn't over, and so you had all these men come home, and again, like usual, when the war ends, there's labor shortages, and so they were like, why are you bringing people from a different country when you can't provide jobs for people in this country? And so the racism towards these bracero workers who were contracted by the United States government was really severe, and the conditions were not great. Now, a lot of braceros took this opportunity because they said, you know, the situation in our country is not ideal right now. So they took this opportunity. They came on the contract, but then didn't return home when the contract ended, and used it as an opportunity to just build a new life for their family in the United States of America. A lot of them stayed, had families, etc. And so in kind of response to the intense sort of racism and the labor shortages, the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, they actually launched an operation called Operation Wetback in 1945. And I know, unfortunately, that some people already are familiar with what that term means, but wetback, actually the term dryback and wetback originated during a little before this time. Dryback was somebody that came into the United States legally. Wetback was referring to somebody that came into the United States or was in the United States, was not in the United States legally, and so the wetback was as if, like, if you crossed across the river and you didn't come through legal means, and you got like wet in the process. So that's kind of where that derogatory term originated from. And the INS actually launches this entire operation, called it Operation Wetback, to repatriate, which means to bring the bracero workers back to their original country, to repatriate braceros. What happens, though, is they actually end up repatriating a lot of, because like I said, many started families and had children born in the United States, which those children are citizens of the United States of America, but many children were wrongfully repatriated with their parents and forced to go back. Well, not even go back. They were born in the United States, but forced to go to Mexico with their parents. And this is still to this date the largest mass deportation of people in the United States of America. So I just wanted to give you guys that information. I know this jumps past World War II, but the Bracero program was initiated to answer those labor shortages. Another thing that the United States did to prepare for the war was they launched this operation, and they actually recruited 29 Native Americans. Most were Choctaw and Cherokee Native Americans, and they were recruited to develop a code. And they used, so you had Navajo, Choctaw, Cherokee, they used a blend of their native languages. Because if you think about it, you guys, there's nowhere else in the world that used that used these languages. And so what they did is they developed a code, and they were used to, and then that's how they transmitted all of the information, and that code remained unbroken throughout the course of the war. So these Native Americans were absolutely essential to developing a code that couldn't be broken, because they would speak it over the radio waves in broad daylight, but the words that they were using and the code that they developed was using their languages, and nobody in the world really had access to that language except in the United States of America. And so, it was impossible for the enemy's essential powers to, the Axis powers to break that code. So yeah, you guys, this is the second assignment you're doing this week. You're actually looking and learning about these Navajo code talkers. It's interesting that they played such a huge role in the United States' success in the war in terms of communication, but I want you guys to learn and see how they were treated prior to the war by the United States. And based on a lot of things that we talked about in this class, you guys can probably imagine a little bit, but I'll let you guys get into that in the activity. So speaking of World War II on the home front, the Double V campaign was a campaign that was initiated by a lot of minorities. It was mostly African Americans that kind of were behind the movement, but a lot of people got on board with it, a lot of minorities in the United States. It was a campaign for victory against Germany and Japan abroad, so that's one V, is campaign for victory against Germany and Japan. So victory against enemies abroad. And then the second V was victory against racism at home. So enemies abroad, enemies within. Double V, double victory. Let's get democracy at home. Let's get democracy abroad. And so this actually takes off. You see like these hairstyles, like the double V hairstyles, if you guys can imagine. Your hair, like women's hair, they would roll it in those big rollers and it made it look like a V. They had all these pins and all this money that they were raising, and it really just goes to show you a lot of the stories I'm telling you guys about Japanese internment, the Zoot Suit riots, which we're going to talk about in a second, the Bracero program. There was a lot of it was a time of difficulty for minorities, but also a time where they wanted to sort of like rise up and kind of fight for, well, if we're fighting for these things abroad, let's fight for them here as well. And so you see a lot of that kind of like empowerment. So speaking of Zoot Suits, I just mentioned that. I don't know how many of you guys have already seen or know of what this style is, but this is kind of like a classic Zoot Suit. It was a style that was adopted by Mexican American youth. It was sort of seen as like a symbol of rebellion against tradition. You had this whole group of teenagers, of young people, these people who either parents had come over in the Bracero program. Well, actually, sorry, it would have been before the Bracero program if they were teenagers at this point. But had come over in the 1920s when there was a really sharp rise in immigration from Mexico. And then now they had their children, and they were not fully Mexican, but they were not fully American. Um, um, and they sort of like felt, because they had this, I mean, I'm sure probably even some of you guys can relate, where it's at home, you kind of have this one sort of style, this one culture, this one way of living, these expectations, and then when you're out at school, which, you know, back in the day when we used to actually go to school, it's like a different world, right? When you're out about, you're living in America. So they kind of felt this like, they didn't feel fully one or the other. They felt a combination of the two. And so they start to, this clothing style kind of becomes this way that they try to just like express who they are. So you have these long jackets and then these high-waisted baggy pants that were usually held up by a belt. So these teenagers, they start to refer to them as pachucos, which are like, that's like how they referred to these teenagers. However, these suits are seen as flashy and even un-American. The reason they were seen as un-American during this time, well, first of all, it was like very identifiable, right? And so they started to say, oh, it's mostly these Mexican American boys that are running in gangs, that are running in gangs in Los Angeles or in these areas. They're the ones that are wearing this like pachuco style, these zoot suits. And so they start to kind of like identify that with like gang life. And then on top of that, it's seen as un-American because if you guys remember, I told you during World War II, the United States was trying to ration goods, right? Except for, you guys can see there's sort of an excessive amount of material on these suits, the high-waisted, baggy, and wool was most of them were made out of wool, and wool was one of the things that was being rationed. And so this wool was obviously purchased on the black market, and so people started to use this as like proof that these young kids were not American and not like dedicated to the cause, if that makes sense. So here you guys can see some more examples of these suits, the long jackets. This doesn't really show the high-waisted pants as much. So I want to talk to you guys about kind of why zoot suits are even a thing. I mean, obviously like the rationing during the war, that relates to World War II, but this is all happening while the war is going on. This is a picture right here, you guys, of Sleepy Lagoon. This was a water reservoir that was in like a gravel pit, and there was a lot of like swimming pools and stuff that were segregated during this time. And so the Sleepy Lagoon was like a known place where a lot of like Mexican and Mexican American youth kind of came to use this sort of like reservoir as like a swimming hole. And there were some gangs, some different like from different neighborhoods that would gather around this area, but it was a very common area for them to kind of come and swim because they were unable to use segregated pools. Now, the reason this becomes a thing is because there was the 38th Street gang, which I'm not going to get into. There was one gang of kind of like young zoot suiters that had conflict with another gang a few streets over. And pretty much after like a series of house parties and being at the Sleepy Lagoon, in the morning, one teenager is dead. The police department decides to do this mass sweep, and they actually arrest 600 Mexican American teenagers after this event takes place. 600. So that is insane, right? To arrest that many people. Anyway, so they're being held. You guys can see some images here. It was mostly pachucos and pachucas, which were like the girls that sort of like hung out with them, that they arrest. In the end, 22 were actually accused and actually went to trial. And they were found guilty, all in varying degrees. So, in the end, it wasn't 600 that were accused for the one death, but 22 of them were found guilty. The longest sentence, there were two boys that were sentenced um, and they actually went to San Quentin to serve their sentences throughout the entire trial. So these are the 22 kids that were actually being tried. Throughout the trial, the prosecutor kept referring to their clothing as like and their hairstyles as like evidence of their wrongdoing, of them being up to no good. So they're found guilty. The verdicts, I have to note, because the Latino community came around these boys and actually raised money and were able to get um, the the entire trial. They went to the Court of Appeals. They appealed the verdicts, and actually all the verdicts were overturned because the judge said there was a complete lack of evidence. So the verdicts are overturned, but all of this, it just intensifies the kind of racism and intensifies the negative attitudes towards these these Mexican American youth, and kind of like emphasize or like sort of like doubles down on stereotypes that they had. Um, so this Sleepy Lagoon murder trial leads exactly into these Zoot Suit riots, which I mentioned before, that these Zoot Suit riots that took place, that the Zoot Suits that they were wearing kind of like were like a sign that they weren't rationing like they were supposed to. So May and June, end of May, early June 1943 in Los Angeles, you had thousands of servicemen that were in the United States Army, and a lot of them were Marines actually, because they were stationed in LA and San Francisco because we were ready for Japan to attack us. So there was a bunch of people that were sitting there waiting for an attack for Japan that were stationed in Los Angeles. So um, it started in late May, and pretty much you had Marines that were walking. You guys can see here in this image, you have Marines that were just like patrolling the streets, looking for groups of these Zoot Suiters, and thousands of them ended up participating in the attacks. The police stood by. They were targeted with beatings, racial slurs, and they were stripped of their zoot suits. So here you guys can see a picture. Their zoot suits were stripped off of them. They were beaten. The suits, the soldiers would pee on them, light them on fire, a variety of things. The police stood by. Newspapers were even kind of encouraging this. It kind of spread to neighborhoods nearby. In the end, there were 500 Mexican Americans that were arrested, and there were 0 servicemen. Again, part of that is like this look where during the war are they going to arrest U.S. Marines, and it was easier to just arrest any kind of Mexican American that was suspected, or Mexican American that was suspected of being involved. So this is what ends up happening. You guys, for your third assignment this week, are going to be looking at 2 different newspapers that are dealing with these Zoot Suit riots, and just looking at how the 2 different groups are depicted, and who you think kind of, well, what actually caused the Zoot Suit riots. So that's one of the assignments, what causes Zoot Suit riots. The second is the Navajo Code Talkers, where you're looking at kind of the origins of these men and the contribution they played in the war. And then the third is this Rosie the Riveter discussion, where you really look at this image and analyze it in comparison to another. So that's the plan for this week. And yeah, I hope you have a good one.